So good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all here today. Today I wanted to continue last week's topic, which is the paramita of Sila, or ethical living. And I wanted to talk about that specifically through the lens of the Bodhisattva Precepts that we practice in Zen. So the topic of today's talk is that Zen and the Precepts are one. So as a little bit of background, Buddhism isn't an ethnic religion. So when we become a Buddhist, we have to do that on purpose. So we consciously decide and we take refuge in the three treasures, in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Buddha is the teacher, Dharma, the teachings, and Sangha, the community. So we have to do that with intention. And sometimes people study and think about it a lot, and other times they're really drawn in through a strong pull that pulls us in. And there's not really a right way or a wrong way, but we do need to have some consciousness of what we're doing and what that means. So during the time of the Buddha, the rules for ethical living, or the Vinaya, came up through monks and nuns making mistakes or asking questions, and then the Buddha would say, oh no, you can't do that. So these would build up over time, as you can imagine. So, everybody was together, living in one area pretty much. And so some of the stranger ones are, can we put owl feathers on our robes? No, you can't put owl feathers on your robes, So that became a rule. And they became a rule because of things people wanted to do. And then the Buddha saying, no, that's not okay. So that's how those came up. So it's a really framework for how to live our life, and a set of rules by which the community lives. So for monks, there are 250 of those, there were in that time. And for nuns, 348 rules. And for lay people, either 5, 8, or 10 rules. And these exist even today in the Theravadan tradition, the tradition that goes down through Thailand and Sri Lanka and on across. Our tradition is Zen, and it comes to us through Dogen Zenji, who lived from 1200 to 1243. And Dogen was originally ordained as a Tendai monk. And as far as we can tell, the Tendai monk Saicho, around the beginning of the 9th century, really felt that we should practice just the Mahayana precepts, or the Northern School precepts. And there was a reason for this. These precepts are more inside-out precepts than outside-in precepts, if you will. And that's a little bit of a misnomer, which I'll unpack a little bit more later. But basically, they're the precepts of how do we want to be in this life, more than what are we not allowed to do. So Dogen took these precepts himself as a Tendai monk in 1213, when he was still a child, and then later went to China to practice. And in China, the Chinese monks and nuns still kept the Vinaya precepts. So this is the distinction that came in. So the precepts that we take in Zen, as I talked about a little bit last week, are the Bodhisattva Precepts. And these are said to be the precepts that when the Buddha woke up and the Buddha was enlightened, these are the precepts that the Buddha realized. So when the Buddha attained unsurpassable awakening, these are the precepts that he set forth. So these are real inside out type of precepts. And these are listed in the Brahmanet Sutra, or the Bonmyokyo. So Dogen Zenji in the Kyoju Kaimon, or the comments on teaching and conferring the precepts, says, the great precepts of the Buddhas have been upheld and maintained by the Buddha. Buddhas conferred them to Buddhas, and ancestors transmitted them to ancestors. Receiving the precepts transcends the borders of the past, the present, and the future. The great precepts of the Buddha have been upheld and maintained by the Buddha. Buddhas conferred them to Buddhas, and ancestors transmitted them to ancestors. Receiving the precepts transcends the borders of past, present, and future. So let me just remind you of what they all are. And today I brought a different translation just so that we have that perspective. So we take refuge in the three treasures. We take refuge in the Buddha. We take refuge in the Dharma. And we take refuge in the Sangha. The Buddha is the one who woke up to reality. The Dharma is reality itself and the way things truly are. And the Sangha are all the people aspiring to study and to live according to the teachings of the true reality of all beings. So these are called the three refuges. I take refuge in Buddha. I take refuge in Dharma. I take refuge in Sangha. And throughout all Buddhist traditions, these three are the core that unite all of us. And said this is really the core of what it means to be a Buddhist, is to take refuge in the three treasures. The next are the three pure precepts. So the precepts of the moral codes as we live them, the precepts of embracing good deeds, and the precepts of embracing all living beings. So these are the direction that we walk on the Bodhisattva path. The three pure precepts. The precepts of restraint or embracing the moral codes. The precept of embracing good deeds. And the precept of embracing all living beings. The three pure precepts. And then last week I talked about the 10 major precepts as well, or sometimes they're called the 10 grave precepts. Grave meaning very serious. So they are not to kill or not to cause harm, not to steal, not to misuse sexuality, not to lie, not to deal in intoxicants, not to speak about the faults of others, not to praise self and put others down, or put ourselves up and put others down, not to be stingy with the Dharma or with material goods, not to give way to anger, and do not disparage the three treasures of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So again, not to cause harm. It just says do not kill, do not steal, do not engage in improper sexual conduct, do not lie, do not deal in intoxicants, do not criticize others, do not praise self and slander others, do not be stingy with the Dharma or with material goods, don't give way to anger, and don't disparage the three treasures of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. The first precept of not to kill, Dogen Zenji in Kyoju Kaimon in the same fascicle in the precepts says, by not killing life, the seeds of the Buddha are nurtured. And one is enabled to succeed the Buddha's life of wisdom. So don't kill life. And this is what allows us to practice. In order to nurture the seeds to actualize Buddha nature, we really should strive not to kill or not to cause harm. And this is the same for all of the other 9 precepts. They show the virtue of the way things are, the true reality of all beings. And these precepts really, yes, we have to keep them. Yes, they also come to us from a teacher. And as we practice, as we really learn to settle our minds, and our ego drops away, then we want to keep these. These come from the inside out as well. We can't imagine harming another being. It feels so contrary to our very nature. Why? Because we understand that everything that arises passes away, that everything is impermanent, and that's very precious. We understand dropping the ego and letting go of our idea of us as separate from you. And we understand that we're all interconnected. And if I am interdependent with you, then I'm not separate from you. So by me upholding the precepts, or so-called me, then you also are upholding the precepts. And if I break the precepts, then I harm you. And so then this, as we understand this clearly, the wish to keep them arises of its own accord. It really grows in us at the same time that we have them as a set of guidelines to hold us when we're, confused about the path. So I talked about this a bit last week. We keep them both from the outside in and from the inside out. And those things, the outside in and the inside out, become fused. These aren't a collection of admonitions, but rather these are the true Dharma that the Buddha woke up to. And this is how we have to approach everything we do in our life. When we talk about living an ethical life, what does that mean? It's not about right or wrong. It's how do we express our true intention in everything that we do? How do we honor the Buddha nature in all beings? How do I bow to the Buddha nature in you? When we see that we are impermanent and that we are not separate, then we don't have anything to hold on to, right? When we're released from attachment, then we are supported by every single thing in the entire universe. We have the support of the entire universe right here and right now, even in these very difficult times, maybe especially in these very difficult times. Knowing that we have the support of the entire universe holds us up. And so we have to invest in this. We have to invest in keeping our practice up and continuing our practice, not for our own self, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. We have to invest in living a life that's upright and cares for others. Again, not for our own self, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. And this is why we keep the precepts. Likewise, the precepts can't be separated out. So once in Japan, I had this teacher that I went to see very early in my practice, and I had been sitting. I had learned how to do zazen, and had done a few silent retreats or sesshin, and enough that my mind had started to settle, and I could see, oh, this is what this is about, just enough to have some understanding that this was a way of life that I wanted to continue. And so I went to this silent retreat for 7 days, and I was so excited. It was my first time in a big Zen monastery instead of a little temple. And it was so old and wonderful and mysterious and great. And it was very cold and very challenging. And we could see the master for doksan, or face-to-face instruction, every day. So I very, earnestly went in and, sat there, and he said, "What is your question?" And I said, I told him my question. In this case, I don't remember exactly what that question was. But then he said to me, he said, "Is it enough just to sit?" And I was just sitting right in front of him. So I said, "Yes." And he leaned forward and he hit the floor and he goes, "No, you must understand. You must keep the precepts." And I said, "Hi, yes." And, he told me a little bit about how important that is. And the things that I recall are that we can't think that we can just go through life only sitting. We can get a kind of sickness that's really ego-based if we think of ourselves as existing separately from the context of the rest of the universe, because we only exist within relationship with others. So because of this, we have to try to be helpful and not to cause harm. So his teaching was that Zen and the precepts are one. And that trying to separate them out causes a separation from it. So we have to understand it's not enough just to sit zazen. We must also keep the precepts. And so I took that to heart. I thanked him and did my prostrations and left, and went back and finished the sesshin and went back to where I was living at the time in southern Japan, and spoke to my teacher at that time, the person I'd been practicing with, and I was like, okay, so I went to the sesshin and it was amazing, and I met this Zen master in a monastery, and my teacher wanted to know what it was like, and I said, well, he told me you must keep the precepts, and then I said, what's a precept? And so he said, okay, there's a ceremony we can do. And so I said, okay, I just did it, And so I did the ceremony of receiving the precepts, and I didn't know what they were. I just threw myself in to the deep end of the pool and trusted the tradition before me and received the precepts. And it's not the way I would recommend going, but that was my way. And what I found was I wanted to keep them from the inside out, not from the outside in. That any impulse I had to break the precepts had dissolved. And some of them I was really keen on not keeping. I had a strong rebellious streak, and I was like, I don't know about all that. And I just found that the will to break them had fallen away. And that's not permanent. It comes and goes. As I said last week, there are times when we have to know when to keep the precepts and when to not keep the precepts, understanding the implications of that. But what really happened for me is that Zazen and the precepts came together and became one way of life that continues. One way of life. We keep the precepts. Sometimes we make mistakes. We atone for our mistakes. We apologize. We make repair. And we continue. We continue our sitting practice. And we let our ego self fall away. And that informs how we keep the precepts. And our wish to break them starts to dissolve. Why? Because again, we're not in this for ourselves. We really see how me keeping the precept of not to harm helps you and you and you and the entire universe. And when we see clearly this way, the wish simply isn't there. So this is what I wanted to say today about Sila the paramita of ethical living in relation to Zen and the precepts. So thank you for listening.